Good morning, class. In this brief video, I'd like to introduce the course Logic and Critical Thinking, as well as the first chapter of the text we're going to be using, Thinking Socratically, the third edition, Critical Thinking About Everyday Issues, as well as the Euthyphro Dilemma and the Euthyphro by Plato, which is featured in the first chapter of this text. So, the first question we might consider is, to what extent is thinking Socratically a form of critical thinking? And how do we define thinking Socratically? The authors provide a dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro in Plato's Euthyphro. Many of Plato's works are given the title of either a subject in which characters will be discussing or the name of one of the characters. And in this particular dialogue is the character Euthyphro. And the story begins with Euthyphro and Socrates meeting at the court. Euthyphro is going to be trying his father for murder, and it's a complicated case, and Socrates has been accused of corrupting the youth. After discussing their particular situations, they begin to ask or question what piety is. And one of the things to consider would be why the authors have chose to utilize this. And a few details or a few points can be made. So Socrates and Euthyphro are both striving to figure out the answer to something, in this case, what piety is. Euthyphro claims to know, Socrates claims not to know, and so Socrates is asking Euthyphro questions so that Socrates might also understand. Throughout the dialogue, both listen to each other's points, both are quite polite to each other, both earnestly want to learn from each other. So this is essentially a good model for engaging in critical thinking discussions as well. Early on in this dialogue, it becomes obvious that Socrates and Euthyphro don't share the same worldview according to the divine, one might say. Euthyphro believes in the gods, and Socrates, it's unclear if he does, but he definitely doesn't believe in the gods the way Euthyphro does. And so with such a fundamental difference, particularly when Euthyphro says piety is what the gods love, we might imagine that the conversation might end right there. Socrates might then say something like, well, I don't really agree with your understanding of the gods. But another important point to sort of point out is that Socrates doesn't do this. Socrates is much more charitable to Euthyphro's argument. And this is also another good point in critical thinking. If you fundamentally disagree with one of the person's premises, that doesn't mean the conversation has to stop. One could try to operate from within the person's system, even though one might not hold the same premises. And so this is what Socrates does. He doesn't just sort of say, I dogmatically do not believe in the gods, but he tries to sort of give a tangible, practical reason as to what might be a source of confusion in the belief of the gods. And as you read in the dialogue, he says, well, all the gods don't want the same thing. So, for example, Kronos and Zeus are sort of set at contrary purpose. What's good for one god might be bad for another, and what's good and vice versa. And so he doesn't just say something like, I don't believe in the gods. He gives a very valid reason for a confusion for accepting his definition, even though he might not believe. So the idea there being critical thinking, and in this case the conversation with another, tried to provide rational points as to why you may disagree with the premise, but still be willing to try to entertain the premise of another, like Socrates does. When Euthyphro can't really answer it, Socrates is again charitable to his argument, and he says, well, let's just assume all the gods will the same thing, or want the same thing. Let's just grant that, and let's continue the conversation. And when we come to the conversation, when they continue the conversation, they approach what is commonly referred to as the Euthyphro Dilemma. I'll scroll down here, and we will. It's on page 15. When you're reading it, we'll get to the actual dilemma part. And Euthyphro explains that piety, that's what they're searching for, the essence of piety, is what the gods love. And also pay attention to the way Socrates questions, because this can be seen as a model of critical thinking. So, for example, Socrates asks, say, well then, Euthyphro, what do we say about piety? Is it not loved by all the gods, according to your definition? And Euthyphro says, yes, this is in dialogue form. And then Socrates asks, because it is pious, or for some other reason? Euthyphro replies, no, because it is pious. Again, Socrates, then it is loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it is not pious because it is loved by them? And so this is the dilemma. See if you can see what's going on between that contrast. Euthyphro says it seems so, and then Socrates replies, but then what is pleasing to the gods is pleasing to them and is in a state of being loved by them because they love it. And then Euthyphro says, of course. And then Socrates says, then piety is not what is pleasing to the gods, and what is pleasing to the gods is not pious, as you say, Euthyphro. They are different things. And this conversation has often been condensed by philosophers with the dilemma saying, do the gods love piety because it is pious, or is it pious because they love it? And those are two, although they sound very similar, try to discern what the difference is between those two remarks. And this becomes the Euthyphro Dilemma. What makes piety pious? Is there some essential quality that makes it pious in and of itself? Or is it because the gods love it that it is pious? This becomes the dilemma. And the book essentially completes much of the dialogue. And then after the dialogue is finished, we get our first set of study questions. And each chapter contains both study questions and exercise questions, and perhaps more than one group. So in this particular first chapter, there's two sets of study questions. And so it might ask something, who is more pious, Euthyphro or Socrates? Why? And then two, some people believe that an act is good because God wills it. From your reading of Euthyphro, what is problematic about this claim? So these are study questions. For your homework, you want to choose one study question and one exercise question. There isn't any due this week, but at the beginning of next week, I'll post the first assignment, and that will be due on Friday of next week. So we have the study questions here, and then toward the end of the chapter, you always find these at the end, we have the exercise questions. And you would just select one of the exercise questions. What you find maybe most interesting, most challenging. If you select one with two parts, such as 4, be sure to do both parts. So in general, how does thinking Socratically relate to critical thinking? Plato, in many of his works, presents dialogue between Socrates and other people. And so we get to see dialogue going on. One person makes a statement, a truth statement usually, and then the other person, usually Socrates, questions that truth statement. And what often happens is a person thinks they know things, they think they have answers, and then after a few questions from Socrates, they realize they don't have the answers they thought they did. And one of the things to sort of consider about our critical thinking is why didn't they themselves just ask themselves those questions? Why were they walking around in what they thought was knowledge, but rather was ignorance? Why didn't it occur to them to ask those questions themselves, as opposed to encountering Socrates and then being asked those questions? And I think that this might be a good way of looking at critical thinking. When you have what is considered knowledge, justified true belief about things, ask yourself those questions the way you might imagine if you encountered Socrates. Socrates might ask you, right? If you think you have knowledge, be critical of it and ask yourself those questions. Now, they give us the example of the Euthyphro. So go ahead and read through it, and I also put an audiobook link. These are meant to be listened to. Listen to it and start to get the style of questioning about the essence, the nature, the definitions of certain things. So you can start to build up a template of how you imagine Socrates might question beliefs of knowledge or knowledge claims that you yourself have. And then when you would do this with your own beliefs, this would be one type of thinking critically about things you take to be knowledge or true. And I think this might be a good introductory into the concept of critical thinking. There's many other ways of looking at logic and critical thinking, and we'll get into those as the course progresses, but this might be a good introduction. So go ahead and listen to the Euthyphro. Go ahead and read the dialogue in the book. Be sure to understand what the Euthyphro Dilemma means, and then look at the study questions and look at the exercise questions, start to ponder them. And then next week, I'll post the assignment, a study question and an exercise question will be due. I'm looking forward to the class, and I hope that this brief introduction helps to understand aspects of the course.